The final note from her cello hung in the air, a perfect, mournful sound that trembled with a life of its own. Zara let the bow fall, her fingers aching, the crimson silk of her dress a whisper against her skin. Applause, polite and distant, rippled through the grand ballroom of the Latte Hotel. She was a ghost here, a piece of the hired entertainment. 18 years old, a scholarship student at the conservatory, and a world away from the diamonds and tailored suits that watched her. She kept her eyes down, a performer's trick to manage the nerves, her gaze fixed on the gleaming marble floor. That is when she made the mistake of looking up. Her eyes snagged on a man who held the center of the room from its edge.
He was not standing.
He was seated in a wheelchair, a machine of polished chrome and black leather that seemed more throne than medical device. His suit was a dark, immaculate gray, tailored so precisely it looked like a second skin over the hard lines of his shoulders and chest. But it was his stillness that commanded attention. In a room full of noise and motion, he was a point of absolute gravity. Everyone orbited him, their laughter a little too loud, their glances a little too frequent. Then she saw the woman. She stood before him, a vision in pale, shimmering gray, her beauty as sharp and cold as a shard of glass. Choi Min-ae, Zara knew her name from the society pages. The daughter of a tech mogul, betrothed to the man in the wheelchair. Kwon Jin-woo. His name was not in the papers. His name was spoken in whispers in back alleys and boardrooms, a name that tasted of fear and power. Min-ae's voice, though low, carried in the sudden, attentive silence. A ring? You offer me a ring, Jin-woo? From that chair? Her laugh was a brittle, ugly thing. I was to be the wife of an emperor, not the nursemaid to a cripple. This engagement is over. The humiliation was a physical force, sucking the air from the room. Every eye was on him, on the velvet box still open in his hand. His face was a mask carved from stone, his expression unreadable. But Zara saw it. A flicker in his dark, obsidian eyes. A tightening of the muscles along his jaw. He did not look at Min-ae. His gaze lifted, sweeping across the silent, watching crowd with an unnerving lack of haste. His eyes were cold, predatory, and utterly empty. And then they found her. They stopped. On the girl in the red dress, the outsider, the musician holding a cello that was her only shield. He looked at her, and for a terrifying second, Zara felt like the only person in the room. He saw her, not just her dress or her instrument, but the core of her, the part that was just as trapped in this glittering cage as he was. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to a man standing behind his right shoulder. The man moved with the silent, efficient grace of a hunting dog. He cut a path through the frozen guests, his destination unmistakable. He stopped in front of her, his presence blocking out the rest of the world. "Miss," he said, his voice a low baritone. "Mr. Kwon requests your presence." It was not a request. The word was a courtesy, a thin veil over the steel of a command. Panic, cold and sharp, pricked at her skin. She clutched her cello tighter. "I think there's a mistake. I'm just the performer." "There is no mistake," the man said, his eyes impassive. She was led across the marble floor, each step an eternity. The silence was so profound she could hear the swish of her dress, the frantic beat of her own heart. She stopped before the wheelchair. Up close, Kwon Jin-woo was even more formidable. A faint scar cut through his left eyebrow, a white line against his tan skin. His hands rested on the arms of his chair, long-fingered and perfectly still, yet they radiated a sense of immense, coiled power. He smelled of sandalwood and something cold, like ozone after a storm. He did not look at the humiliated woman who still stood nearby, her face pale with shock at being so thoroughly ignored. He looked only at Zara. "Your name," he said. His voice was deep, a low rumble that vibrated through the floor. "Zara," she managed, her own voice a thin thread. "Zara Kinsley." "Zara," he repeated, and the sound of her name in his mouth was different. It was an act of possession. He turned his head slightly, his gaze finally falling upon the stunned face of his former fiancée. His voice was quiet, yet it sliced through the ballroom, reaching every corner. "You are right, Min-ae. I cannot offer my wife a husband who can stand. But I can offer her an empire. His eyes came back to Zara, pinning her in place. The wedding will be tomorrow. My assistant will handle the arrangements. He had not asked her. He had informed the world. He had taken her, a complete stranger, and placed her on an empty throne to prove that the throne itself was all that mattered. The woman in gray stumbled back, her face a mask of disbelief and fury. The guests began to murmur, the shock breaking like a fever. Zara stood frozen, the cello in her hand, the last piece of a life that had just been erased. She had been hired to play music for an hour. Instead, she had been drafted into a war, a pawn in a game of power she couldn't begin to understand. Quan Jinwoo's assistant gently took the cello from her numb fingers. Another guard appeared at her other side. She was being escorted away, her fate sealed in a single, brutal act of pride. That was the moment everything changed. She had walked into this grand hall as a musician. She was leaving as the property of the most dangerous man in Seoul. The penthouse was a cage of glass and steel, suspended high above the glittering sprawl of Seoul. For 3 days, Zara saw nothing but the panoramic view of the Han River and the cold, minimalist furniture that filled the space. She was a prisoner in a palace, her red dress replaced by a wardrobe of exquisitely tailored clothes she hadn't chosen. Her cello sat in a corner of the vast living room, untouched, a monument to a life that no longer felt real. Quan Jinwoo was a constant, silent presence. He worked from a sprawling office at one end of the penthouse, his wheelchair moving with a near-silent hum across the polished concrete floors. He took calls in Russian, Japanese, and English, his voice always the same low, controlled monotone. He treated her not with cruelty, but with a chilling indifference, as if she were another piece of art acquired to adorn his home. Her presence was a fact, not a consideration. She learned who he was in fragments, from overheard conversations and the deferential fear of the men who came and went. The Golden Coil Syndicate, an empire built on shipping, tech, and the dark, violent currents that ran beneath the city's surface.
He was not a businessman.
He was a king. The first crack in his armor appeared on the 4th night. The air in the penthouse grew thick with a tension that had nothing to do with her. Men with grim faces and holsters visible beneath their jackets moved through the rooms, their movements clipped and precise. Jinwoo was in his office, the door for once left slightly ajar. Zara, drawn by the palpable sense of crisis, stood in the hallway, hidden in the shadows. The Black Turtles are making a move on the port, his lieutenant, Mr. Choi, reported. They think the incident at the gala was a sign of weakness. They're testing the perimeter. Jinwoo's back was to her. He was staring out at the city lights, a glass of whiskey untouched on the desk beside him. Weakness is a perception, he said, his voice dangerously soft. Let them test it. Let them find it wanting. Double the guards on Sector 4. I want their captain's name on my desk by morning. And find out who talked. There is a leak. Yes, sir. Choi. Jinwoo called as the man turned to leave. My cousin Sang-hoon. Where is he? He's overseeing the Gangnam operations as instructed. Keep a man on him. A loyal man. The words hung in the air. My cousin. A seed of understanding began to sprout in Zara's mind. A king in a wheelchair. A cousin in a position of power. A warning to watch him. The danger became real an hour later. It wasn't a loud assault, but something far more insidious. A sudden power cut plunged the penthouse into darkness, the emergency lights casting long, distorted shadows. The sharp crack of silenced gunfire echoed from the direction of the private elevator. Zara's heart leaped into her throat. She didn't scream. Her training, the endless hours of discipline her cello had demanded, took over. She flattened herself against the wall, making herself a smaller target. Jinwoo's voice cut through the darkness from his office, calm and absolute. Choi, report. Lobby team is down. They're in the elevator shaft. The fight was swift and brutal. Zara heard grunts, the sickening thud of bodies hitting the floor, and then silence. A moment later, the lights flickered back on. Choi stood in the doorway, his tie askew, a streak of blood on his cheek. 2 of his men dragged a masked intruder into the room. Jinwoo wheeled himself out of the office. He looked at the captured man, his face impassive, but his eyes were blazing with a cold fire. He had not moved from his chair, yet he was the most lethal thing in the room. Then Zara saw it. A dark stain was spreading on the sleeve of his white shirt, just below the shoulder.
Blood.
In the chaos, a stray bullet had grazed him. His men were too focused on the intruder, on the threat, to have noticed. She moved before she thought. She crossed the room, her slippers silent on the floor. She knelt beside his wheelchair, ignoring the shocked look from Choi and the sudden, sharp intake of Jinwoo's breath. "You're hit," she said, her voice steady. He looked down at her, his eyes narrowed. It was the first time he had truly looked at her since the night of the gala. He seemed surprised to find her there, a real person, not just a symbol. "It's nothing," he said, his voice tight with dismissal. "It will get infected if it's not cleaned." She looked at Choi. "Is there a first aid kit?" The lieutenant, nonplussed, simply nodded toward a bathroom. Zara retrieved it, her hands working with a practiced efficiency. She cut away the fine fabric of his shirt, exposing the angry red gash along the hard muscle of his arm. Her touch was gentle but firm, impersonal and professional. He sat utterly still, watching her. He didn't flinch when she cleaned the wound with antiseptic, hissing only slightly as the alcohol stung. She worked in silence, her focus absolute. She could feel the heat of his skin, the solid strength of his body. She was aware of his gaze on her face, on her hands. The silence between them was not empty. It was charged with unspoken things. In the middle of violence and death, this one small act of care felt intimate and profoundly dangerous. When she was done, she taped the bandage neatly in place. She looked up and met his eyes. He was watching her with an intensity that stole her breath. He had seen her, not as the girl in the red dress, not as his decorative wife, but as someone who did not fall apart in a crisis. Someone who acted. She could have run during the attack. The chaos would have been the perfect cover. But she hadn't. She had stayed. She had chosen, in that small moment, to help him. "Zara," he said. The name was a quiet acknowledgement, a question, and a statement all in one. He said it as if he were tasting it for the first time, realizing it belonged to the woman kneeling before him, the woman whose steady hands had just tended to his wound. He was Kwon Jinwoo, a man who controlled a dark empire from a wheelchair. And she was beginning to understand that his paralysis was not his only wound. The deeper one, the one he never showed, was the betrayal that had put him in that chair in the first place. The days that followed were a study in tension. The failed attack on the penthouse had tightened the coil of Jinwoo's control over his empire and, by extension, over her. He was a master strategist, his mind a labyrinth of contingencies and calculations. Zara watched him, learning the rhythms of his power. She saw how a single, quiet phone call could make a politician change his vote, how a discreetly delivered message could bankrupt a rival company overnight. His body was bound to the chair, but his reach was terrifyingly long. She began exploring the penthouse, testing the boundaries of her gilded cage. She found his library, a room lined with floor-to-ceiling shelves filled not just with Korean literature, but with Sun Tzu, Machiavelli, and obscure military histories in a half-dozen languages. It was the armory of a general who fought his wars in silence. One evening, tucked away in a drawer of an antique desk, she found what she was not supposed to see. It was a leather-bound ledger. Curiosity, a dangerous and compelling impulse, made her open it. It wasn't financial records. It was a log, written in Jinwoo's precise, angular script. Names, dates, and single-word annotations.
Debt. Paid.
Final. Erased. It was a catalog of death, a balance sheet of lives taken to maintain his empire. Her stomach turned. This was not an abstract concept of danger anymore. This was the cold, hard proof of the man she was tied to. He was a killer. She closed the book, her hands trembling slightly, and slid it back into the drawer just as the silent hum of his wheelchair approached. He stopped in the doorway, his eyes missing nothing. He knew. He had seen the flicker of her movement, the guilt on her face. He wheeled himself into the room, stopping before the desk. He did not open the drawer. He simply looked at her, his expression unreadable. What you imagine, he said, his voice level, is likely worse than the reality. And the reality is worse than anything you can imagine. He expected fear. He expected her to shrink away from him, horrified. But something else rose in her. A cold, clear anger. The men in this book, she said, her voice low but steady. Did they have cousins? The question hit him like a physical blow. The mask slipped. For a fraction of a second, she saw a flash of raw, unguarded pain in his eyes before it was buried again. That was his wound. The betrayal by his own blood, the one that had cost him his legs. She had aimed for the one vulnerability he could not hide. "Leave," he commanded, his voice like ice. It was the first time he had ever looked truly angry with her. The war between them had been tested, but the war outside was escalating. The Black Turtles, led by a man named Kong, were growing bolder. They saw Jinwoo's new, foreign wife not as a power move, but as a loose thread they could pull to unravel his entire organization. The moment one of them almost lost the other came a week later. Jinwoo, for reasons he did not explain, had allowed her to visit her old conservatory mentor, a kind, elderly woman named Mrs. Park. The visit was heavily supervised, with two of his best men as shadows. They sat in a small cafe near the school, the guards at a nearby table, trying to be inconspicuous and failing completely. It happened in a blur. A black van screeched to a halt. Men in masks swarmed out. It wasn't a kidnapping attempt. It was an execution. Their target was her. Back in the penthouse, Jinwoo watched it unfold on a series of monitors, his feed patched in from street cameras and his men's body cams. He saw the van, saw the men, saw Zara shove Mrs. Park under the table an instant before the windows of the cafe exploded inward. He gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles white, a guttural sound of fury caught in his throat. He was a king watching his most valuable piece about to be swept from the board, and he was powerless to physically intervene. But Zara was not a passive piece. As one of the masked men lunged for her, she reacted. She grabbed the steaming pot of coffee from the counter and threw it directly in his face. The man screamed, staggering back, and that gave her guards the opening they needed. The fight was brutal and short. When it was over, Zara was trembling, her face pale, but she was unharmed. She had done something she never thought herself capable of. She had acted with a violence that was a pale reflection of the world she now inhabited. She had crossed a line. That night, the silence in the penthouse was heavier than ever. Jinwoo found her standing by the glass wall, staring down at the city. "They used you to get to me," he said. It was not an apology. It was a statement of fact. "I know," she whispered. He moved his chair closer, stopping beside her. The scent of sandalwood and ozone filled the small space between them. "Your presence in this house was meant to be a symbol of my strength," he admitted, his voice rough. "A message to my enemies that I am untouchable, that I can take whatever I want." He paused, his gaze fixed on her reflection in the glass. "Instead, it has become my only weakness." It was the most honest thing he had ever said to her. Not a declaration of love, but something far more dangerous. An admission of vulnerability. A confession that she mattered. She told herself staying was survival. She was lying to herself. The enemy's final move was crueler than she could have imagined. It was not a direct attack. It was a simple message delivered to Jinwoo's phone. A photograph. Mrs. Park, her old mentor, tied to a chair in a dimly lit room. The text was simple. The concert hall. Midnight. Your wife comes alone, or the old woman's music ends for good. They were targeting him by targeting the last piece of her old life. The stakes were no longer about his empire. They had become brutally personal. The concert hall was a cathedral of silence. The place where Zara had once poured her soul into her music was now a trap, cold and cavernous. Jinwoo had forbidden her to go. He would handle it, he had said. He would send his men. He would burn Kang's entire organization to the ground to get Mrs. Park back. But Zara knew Kong didn't want a war. He wanted a trophy. He wanted to break Jinwoo by taking the one thing he couldn't protect with armies and money. Her. She was never rescued passively. That was not her way. She left the penthouse while Jinwoo was coordinating his assault, slipping out with the help of a maid she had befriended. She took nothing but a small, sharp letter opener from his desk. She went not to surrender, but to dictate the terms of the battle. She walked onto the empty stage, the single ghost light casting a lonely glow. The vast, dark auditorium held its breath. "I'm here," she called out, her voice clear and steady, amplified by the perfect acoustics she knew so well. Kong emerged from the shadows of the wings, a cruel smile on his face. Mrs. Park was nowhere in sight. "Brave girl, your husband is a fool to value you so much." "My husband," Zara said, taking a step forward, "is a fool for many things. Underestimating his enemies is not one of them." That was the signal. From the balconies, from the orchestra pit, from the backstage corridors she had mapped out for them, Jin Woo's men emerged. They moved with silent, lethal grace. Kang's men were surrounded before they could even raise their weapons. But Kong was smart. He grabbed Zara, pulling her against him, a knife pressed to her throat. "Call them off," he snarled, his eyes wild. "Or she dies right here." The world narrowed to the cold edge of the blade against her skin. She could feel his hot, panicked breath on her neck. She did not struggle. She looked past him, her eyes searching the shadows at the back of the hall. And then she saw him. Jin Woo was there, at the top of the center aisle, his wheelchair a dark silhouette against the faint light from the lobby. His face was stark, his jaw tight with a fury so cold it was terrifying. He was not supposed to be here. He had risked everything to come himself. He did not speak. He simply lifted a hand. It was not a command to his men. It was a message for her.
Wait.
Zara knew this was her moment. She had to do something that would change the outcome. "He won't trade," she said to Kong, her voice a low, conversational murmur. "He'll let you kill me, because he knows the price for my life is your entire world. And he will enjoy collecting that debt." She felt Kang's grip falter for a fraction of a second. It was the opening she needed. She stomped her heel down, hard, on his instep, and as he grunted in pain, she drove her elbow back into his ribs. The knife clattered to the stage floor. She scrambled away as the first gunshot echoed through the hall. The confrontation was over in seconds. Kong lay on the stage, a single, precise bullet hole in his forehead. The threat was neutralized. Jin Woo wheeled himself down the aisle, his men parting before him like water. He stopped at the edge of the stage, his eyes only on her. The silence returned, heavy and profound. Mrs. Park was safe, already rescued from a warehouse across town. The cost had been paid. Zara's old life, her innocence, the simple girl who played the cello. All of it was gone, burned away in the crucible of the last few weeks. He looked at her, standing on the stage under the ghost light, her face smudged with dust, her body trembling with adrenaline. He saw not the pawn he had chosen, but the queen who had checkmated his enemy. His acknowledgement of what she was to him was not a tender word or a soft touch. It was something far more significant. Later that night, back in the silent penthouse, his lieutenant, Mr. Choi, brought her a single, sealed file. "From Mr. Kwan," he said and left. She opened it. Inside was every piece of information the Golden Coil had on Kwan Sang-hoon, his cousin, the man who had betrayed him, the man who had put him in the wheelchair. Financial records, secret locations, known associates, every vulnerability. It was the blueprint for his destruction. At the bottom was a handwritten note from Jin Woo. "Justice is a debt. This one is yours to collect." It was an abdication and an offering. He was giving her the power to avenge him. It was the most profound declaration of trust he was capable of, an admission that his empire, his future, his very vengeance, was now intertwined with hers. She walked to the great glass wall, the file heavy in her hand, and looked out at the sea of lights that was Seoul. This city was a kingdom of predators, and she was no longer prey. The hum of his wheelchair approached, stopping just behind her. He did not speak. He did not touch her, but his presence was a solid, undeniable weight at her back, a silent promise. She had been a stranger in a red dress, a girl who made beautiful, sad music. Now she was something else entirely. She held the power to ruin the man who had crippled her husband, and in this dark, glittering world, that power was a language more intimate than love. She had made her choice, and the city below waited for her next move.